Hello there everyone, and welcome to our webinar today with DisruptOps on AWS security mistakes and how to stop them. My name is Danielle Chapman. I work in the marketing team at Bytes, and today I'm pleased to be joined by Matt Dean and Mike Rothman from DisruptOps. Matt is product manager and Mike is the co-founder. I'm also joined by my colleague Adam, who is Bytes AWS services director. Okay, so now I'm going to pass over to Adam.
Good afternoon, everyone. So welcome to our webinar. My name is Adam Thornton. As Daniel introduced, I'm our AWS director. So I'm just going to give you a quick overview of our practice, our cloud practice, do a very brief introduction to Disrupt, and then I'll pass over to the guys so that we can keep as much of the time allocated to them. I will do a quick next steps, and then we'll go into the Q&A at the end. Okay, Daniel, next slide, please. So a bit of background of Bytes, for those of you who don't know. So today we are 350 staff across multiple UK and Ireland offices. We're a plus 500 million pound reseller. So that really puts us in the kind of the top bracket of the value add reseller space in the UK. We've got a strong public sector business, but really for the point of this call, I want to focus in on our partnerships and what specifically we're doing with Amazon and Azure from a cloud services perspective. Next slide, Daniel, please. So to date, from an Amazon perspective, we're an advanced consulting partner. We hold many competencies, but our focus and really what you're going to hear from the DisruptOps guys is that our business and where we see ourselves helping clients is really taking a lot of the operational challenges from cloud away from you and taking away a lot of the unknowns, giving you visibility, control, and most importantly, confidence that you are engineering workloads and applications in the right way from the ground up, following best practice, and that's both from AWS and Azure. But I think you can see from the competence that we hold there, we really have tried to ensure that we are that operational excellence partner for our customers to work with. And I'll explain a little bit more about how the team is constructed. Next slide, please, Daniel. Thank you. So the next two slides that I'm going to go through, whilst you'll see a lot of the terminology referencing AWS, these services are across Azure and Amazon. At the forefront of what we're trying to achieve is that customer interaction and communication and dialogue with customers is paramount. So all of our people and systems are engineered to ensure we get high levels of positive feedback from any engagement, whether it's looking at technical optimization of your platforms, commercial optimization, security or governance. We want to make it as easy as possible for you to work with us. So we've got various different systems and platforms in place, and we can integrate with your systems, your teams, through Microsoft Teams, Slack channels. It's all about giving excellent customer service. And so we don't typically tend to operate in days and weeks for projects. We're very much focused in on working to hours, being able to give customers complete visibility of how we burn down against those hours and giving that complete transparency. So next slide, please, Daniel. So really, this slide, this talks about the 5 pillars of the Amazon well-architected framework, but ultimately, this is what we base our business and our practice on. So you can see there's the 5 different pillars as Amazon see it. They're very similar when you talk about Azure. And so what we've done is we've identified and built out a range of services and partnerships with various different vendors and technologies in the market to ensure that we can not only cover all various different aspects of the well-architected framework, but actually all of these technologies are leading them respective markets, and so we're trying to partner with best of breed technologies where possible. And so really that leads us on to how did our DisruptOps partnership come about. So you can see here we've got services to help with wider security in the form of Armor, and Bytes has a very strong security business and practice. When we talk about reliability, continuity, just even in basic forms of backup, we have a partnership with Druva. And then looking at technical performance, operational excellence, and managing cost and governance. We have a great partnership with Cloud Health, and we do a cost optimization service for both AWS and Azure, and we can go into more of that detail separately if you'd like to understand how we're able to help customers realize anything up to 30% savings on their ongoing cloud consumption. But we identified that even though we've got some great partnerships here, there was a gap, and it just so happened when we were at Amazon reInvent in Vegas in December that we met up with the DisruptOps guys, and it's fair to say we were blown away by their technology and their approach, and it really brings something new to the table for Bytes to talk to their customers about. So without further ado, I'm going to let the guys talk about how they address some of the security challenges and where they find that technology sits in a niche in the market. But from our perspective, the technology sits within our wider service offering. So if there are any questions, one of the call to actions I'm going to talk about is actually let's get in and test the technology and really prove the value. So I'm going to pass over to Mike, and he's going to take you through some of the security mistakes, which there are many, but more importantly, how to stop them and how to drive that automation, especially at scale, utilizing the DisruptOps platform. So, Mike, over to you.
You bet. Thank you, Adam, and it's great to be here. Good afternoon, everybody that's on the call. It's actually morning over here in the U.S., so I've kind of shaken out the jams a little bit. Got my coffee. So I'm ready to go and really to help everybody understand a little bit about, as Adam said, right, some of the challenges that you're going to face as you're moving into AWS. And again, a lot of these things are somewhat consistent. If you're thinking about Azure as a platform, we're going to focus on AWS today, but dealing with kind of cloud computing is certainly a big issue that you have to deal with. Adam did provide a little bit of background in terms of DisruptOps. We'll provide a little bit more as we go through. But again, this isn't really about kind of the company DisruptOps. It's really just about trying to help you guys understand what you're going to be dealing with. We've kind of watered it down to 5 of the top AWS security mistakes. There were probably about 25. But these are the ones that we picked out that again are most impactful and we think need to be dealt with immediately. So in terms of introductions, I am Mike Rothman. I'm a co-founder of DisruptOps. I'm a 25 plus, actually closer to 30-year security professional now, but who's counting? At that point, you can see the gray hair. It's I used to have dark hair before I got into security, so take that for what it is. And I've actually been doing cloud stuff for close to 10 years at this point. I've been a partner and a trainer with the Cloud Security Alliance. We helped build out the guidance of, basically the Cloud Security Alliance guidance that really governs and provides some perspective in terms of what cloud security looks like. We've been, again, partnered with them for close to 10 years as well. And a lot of the research that we were doing early on into cloud computing and cloud security resulted in DisruptOps. So that's kind of how that came along. I also have Matt Dean, who is our fantastic head of product here. I don't know, Matt, did you want to introduce yourself a little bit, or do you want me to make some stuff up about you?
Oh, feel free, Mike. I'd love to hear what I've done. No, just kidding. Hey, good afternoon, everyone. My name's Matt Dean. As Mike said, I'm product manager at DisruptOps. Prior to joining DisruptOps, I spent about 14 years building a product called Firemon in the firewall management space. And so I've spent almost 20 years now in the network security space, have done the on-premise aspect of kind of the enterprise firewall side, and am now focused on the cloud aspect of it.
Great, thank you, Matt. And again, we're very happy and grateful to have Matt on our team. I've known Matt for again probably 10 plus years, if not a little bit longer. So he's a fantastic add to our team, and he'll be kind of running you through a little bit more about DisruptOps, whereas I'm really going to focus on the AWS security issues as we move forward. So let's jump in, right? So when you start thinking about moving a lot of your workloads and applications into AWS, it's obviously a different world, right? There are a lot of folks that kind of basically take what they have and move it specifically and directly into the cloud, right? We call that lift and shift. So that's the idea of you just take your exact data center architecture, you just, pop it right up into the cloud, and you use a lot of the controls, you use a lot of the structure. It basically looks just like your data center. You're just kind of outsourcing your data center or time sharing your data center. And obviously there are lots of issues with that. We're not going to dive into it too much in this specific talk. But really what we want to deal with is when you start to think about architecting or re-architecting a lot of those workloads specifically for the cloud, specifically for AWS, what are some of the things you're going to be facing? What are some of the challenges that you have to think about? And we've just listed 4 here. Again, there are probably another 10 beyond that, but we'll focus on these 4. And first is scale, right? So what you have to do is really start thinking about how are you going to scale up and contract your environment as you are moving forward and as you are trying to, again, move these workloads into the environment. Because when you build and when you can so easily add capacity and different kinds of resources, you end up in a situation where, again, that creates tremendous complexity. Let's talk a little bit about multiple policy types and locations, and actually 2 out of the 4 or 5 big security issues that we have pointed out really do relate specifically to policy challenges in terms of managing that. And recently I got certified as an AWS security specialist. So yes, I'll pat myself on the back a little bit here, give myself a little bit of an attaboy. But it was stuff I'd been doing for close to 10 years. Just I decided to sit for the test with AWS. And it's interesting in that a full 25, 30% of the test is just understanding how all of these policies interleave and work together. And that just creates tremendous complexity. You can have different policies for an S3 bucket versus identity management, different policies for keys. If you're using the key management service or having AWS issue your own keys. So again, there are just so many different policy types, object policies, resource policies. There's a ton of overlap, and really managing that overlap becomes critical, because if you don't get that right, you can create, again, big holes in your environment wide enough to basically drive a truck through. You've got complexity and inconsistency issues with AWS. And again, I really think that has to do with the fact that they've been an entity, right? An ongoing entity for 12 to 14 years, not the 30, 40, 50 years that we've been doing technology stuff in our data center. So you've got just issues, and they're moving faster than we've ever seen in terms of introducing new capabilities, introducing new features. So that creates, again, just a lot of challenge in terms of making sure that you have a consistent environment across what is now 218 disparate AWS services. And then to make it more complicated, they've got, I want to say, 40 something different regions within AWS. Not all services are available in all regions. So depending on where you're doing business, depending on where your compute is happening, you may have some services that are available in one region, other services that aren't available in another. So again, that makes specific challenges in terms of managing your environment consistently. Right, and then finally, we'll point out visibility. Again, being a almost 30-year security professional, it's been drummed into my head that we focus on visibility and then control before we worry about that. And in a lot of cases, because anybody with a credit card can set up an AWS account and start doing things. By the way, they can set up Azure and Google Cloud as well. So it's not just an AWS issue, but you do have, in effect, a democratization of technology now. Not everything has to go through the IT group, which creates just challenges in terms of understanding where all of the compute is happening in an environment. And that, again, creates challenges in terms of securing it. So how do we select these security mistakes? Well, again, part of what I do on a daily basis is help larger organizations assess their environment. I know the Bytes guys can help you with that as well. So these are the things that we found, right? And when we're doing an assessment, this is really the order that we look for stuff in terms of these 5, because they tend to be most business impactful and they tend to be most frequent in terms of when we find things. And it really is amazing when you ask a lot of the IT folks, hey, have you addressed this? They're like, sure, yeah, we totally addressed that. And then, you set up a couple of tools or you look through their policies and you realize, oh, maybe not. Why? For a lot of the reasons I pointed out here. There are multiple policy types and locations, right? There's a lot of complexity. There's a lot of inconsistency. You've got technology happening in all areas of your business, which again creates an opportunity to have problems. So let's dive in to the specific 5 questions or 5 security mistakes. And the first we'll point out here is overprivileged identity management. And that's one of the things that folks have to get their arms around as they move towards the cloud, is that there's this saying, identity is the new perimeter, right? I don't even know what that means, but of course, what it means is every resource has an identity and can be given an entitlement. So we have to think not necessarily just about how do I block access to things, it's what is this specific resource entitled to do. So it totally changes how you have to think about identity management, where it was kind of in data center land, right? That's much more about making sure that you can get into and log into specific systems and that you've got, one authoritative source. In the cloud, identity really breaks down to everything. So what are the issues that we have when we kind of think about overprivileged identity and access management? You get too many base privileges to user groups or roles, often due to multiple policies. I talked about that policy overlap. Well, if one policy is a little bit more permissive than another, depending on how you structure them, the more permissive one may win out. Failure to constrain resources when using allow statements. So when you set up an identity management policy, you can do allow or denies. Obviously, if you allow specific things, that can be overly broad. Poor management of who and what can use roles. And Cruft, right? Cruft is not going back and cleaning that stuff up. My friend Matt knows a lot about that because a lot of the business that Firemon was in back in the day was really about helping folks remove Cruft from their firewall policies. Well, just think about not just firewall policies, but pretty much everything that you have running in your cloud can have entitlements which need to be managed. Incorrect conditional implementation. So a conditional would be if it's in one environment or one region. The most frequent use of conditionals that we run into is dev versus or prod versus non-prod, right? Sometimes it's dev, sometimes it's test, but prod versus non-prod. So you have different entitlements in your prod environment than you have in your non-prod environments. And again, for obvious reasons, non-prod should be open up to devs. They need to try stuff, they need to do things. And the ops folks, prod you want totally locked down. So if you mess that up, obviously that can create a situation where you've overprivileged your identity management. Failure to use deny statements, right? So deny in AWS lingo really overarcs everything. So you can have a specific and explicit deny statement that pretty much blocks off access to everything. If you don't use that, it by default allows. So it denies, and then if you specifically have an allow statement, then allow would override everything unless you have, again, that explicit deny statement. So not using those deny statements can, again, create an overprivileged situation. And finally, failing to properly use resource policies. We'll talk about that when we talk about S3 buckets in a second. But the resource policies are, again, another backstop that you use in combination with the identity management policies in order to lock down some of your resources. What's the impact of overprivileged identity management? Well, you can have privilege escalation, which obviously we all know from Security School 101 is not a great thing that allows folks to do things in your environment. Abuse, data loss or destruction. Ultimately, it gets down to arbitrary cloud execution. You'll see that a lot because most of these mistakes result in some way, shape, or form in arbitrary cloud execution, but really privilege escalation is the main impact that we see when you have overprivileged identity and access management. So what do we do? We're not going to go through all of these because, again, we've got to get through a lot of content before our time is up. But again, what you want to do is plan out your identity management strategy before you start doing things. Not that you can't go back and retrofit to the right policies, but the idea of thinking and embracing least privilege everywhere, default deny where you can based upon what services you're using, and making sure that everybody understands what that means in your environment is absolutely critical. We talked about conditionals, right? So different policies for debt and fraud. Use some of the AWS native services that are available. IAM Access Advisor is a new service that AWS released or introduced back at reInvent in November, which, by the way, seems like 3 or 4 lifetimes ago after I've been in my basement for about 4 months. But use the Access Advisor, which goes through and uses some internal AWS machine learning technology called Zelkova to analyze all of your identity policies and then point out where you potentially have issues. You know, again, scanning and reducing privilege escalation permissions and admin level rows, add your deny backstops, again, resource constraints, and be smart with conditionals, and ultimately test your environment. What AWS has, and this is one of the things we teach in our labs, is to use a policy simulator, right? So when you put a policy together, you can actually play around with it to make sure that it has the desired effect to allow certain behaviors and to deny other behaviors. So again, a lot of this seems very complicated, and when you think about identity management, it is. So I mentioned my security certification. Again, a lot of the test, a lot of becoming proficient at AWS is really understanding how these policies work and how you can use them to your advantage. So the point here, constantly assess and enable real-time notifications for any identity management changes in the production account. So you want to make sure that you are alerting on changes in your environment. In a lot of cases, they'll be legit, right? They could be authorized changes, but in the event that they're not, this is where overprivileged IAM will hurt you. So having some type of notification is absolutely critical, and the idea of continually assessing and monitoring your environment for these changes, again, becomes a pretty important aspect of what you need to do. So we'll talk about that, and I know Matt will talk about that quite a bit when we talk really about the value and the capabilities that DisruptOps brings to your environment. So let's pivot a little bit and talk a little bit about public S3 buckets. So many of you, if you've been paying attention at all to, you know, kind of cloud attacks or the security business in general, are probably familiar with these public S3 bucket breaches or data losses or whatever you want to call them. That tends to be the highest profile environment, the highest situation where we see these kinds of mistakes. And why is it so complicated to protect these buckets? Well, I kind of mentioned and have been harping on these policy things overarching, but you have just a ton of different policies that you can set for each S3 bucket that you have, right? You can have a bucket ACL or an object ACL, right? Access control list for who can access that either storage bucket or a resource or object within that bucket. So that's really at the lowest level. You can have bucket policies that, you know, really apply to the entire bucket. You can have resource policies that apply to S3 as a resource, and you can have identity management policies that really dictate how you use those buckets and who can access them. And by the way, you can probably sit there and say, gosh, Mike, they all seem the same. Well, with the exception of the ACLs, which really just lock down what resources can be accessed. You're right. I mean, there's a lot of overlap between how you and the number of different ways or mechanisms you have to secure S3, right? So again, you know, bucket or object ACLs I talked about, bucket policies, identity management rules, and then you have other ways to access S3, something like cores, which, you know, the cross-origin resource sharing, that gives you the ability to basically connect to an S3 bucket from a totally different account. Let's say you've got an image store or a document management repository, and you have that and need to have that accessed via a different application. You would set up basically a cores link between those accounts. If you do that wrong, you can certainly put a situation where you've got open access to the S3 bucket. CloudFront is AWS's native content distribution network, or CDN. So you basically set up a CloudFront instance or endpoint there that connects into your S3 bucket to access the content and then really spread it out and cache it. So if you have the wrong origin access identity, you can again provide unfettered access to this device. And then you have other application-oriented challenges that can result in open access to the storage bucket, whether SSRF, that's you know, a specific attack that was utilized in the Capital One breach that I'm sure all of you heard about. That was about 18 months ago, or the compromised server. And the problem is, in those situations, that server has access to the buckets, right? So it's a totally legit authorized access to the bucket. It's just based on a bad actor or malicious actor that is within your environment. So again, lots of different ways to compromise the S3 environment. As I mentioned, 5 to 7 ways S3 data can be made public, not all of which are intuitive, many of which are edge cases, especially things like CORS or CloudFront origin access identity, access identity. So again, you know, it's hard to make sure that you've kind of really closed off all of the different aspects, all of the different ways that your S3 buckets can be impacted. The impact, we've all heard about it, right? That's data leaks, compliance violations. Again, just do a quick search on AWS S3 data exposed, and you'll come up with all sorts of new things that have happened probably within the last week. When you think about it, this is really the most visible of the attacks or of the breaches that result from AWS and can result from a number of different things that we'll actually talk about. But this is the one that tends to be a little bit more high profile. How do you fix it? Well, there are a number of different native capabilities that AWS brings in order to do that, right? So use your S3 public access settings. And again, those are the bucket policies and the resource policies and the identity management policies to make sure that those protect and lock down access to those buckets. You can use a service called Trusted Advisor, which actually looks in your environment and makes sure that you have things configured correctly, and it will give you alerts when it finds stuff that is not configured correctly. Although that is limited, it will not hit a lot of those edge cases. AWS Config is another native Amazon service that looks for how every resource in your environment is actually configured, and it tracks those configuration changes so you know when something changed, but it is, again, not going to be pervasive. You can build your own guardrails. So that's the idea, that you would do an assessment of your environment, and hopefully continuously, but certainly on some type of schedule. And then when you find one of these issues, you have a Lambda or some other type of function that would reset or set the policy to something that you would want it to be. Third-party assessment tools, otherwise known as Cloud Security Posture Management or CSPM tools, our friends at Gartner have coined that term, or a third-party guardrails tool like DisruptOps, and there are a handful of others in the environment. But the idea here shown by the screenshot is the ability to remove a bucket policy if it doesn't make sense, restrict the bucket policy to specific IP addresses to ensure that only the right authorized networks can access those buckets, as well as, again, and probably another 20 different knobs that you have in order to set those identity and resource policies to lock down S3. So we've gone through overprivileged identity management. We've gone through S3 buckets. Those tend to be the ones that, you know, we see most frequently. And we also see a lot of problems with multi-factor authentication, or MFA. I can go through and tell a long, drawn-out story relative to how you lock down, you know, and some of the issues to lock down and make sure that you require a second factor, you know, so you can require MFA for console access, require MFA for API access, or utilize the identity provider if you're federating to make sure that, again, MFA is used for those environments. What are the issues here? Credential theft, accidental credential exposure, can result in arbitrary cloud execution. And understand that if you lose control of your AWS console, you basically lose control of your entire environment. So, you know, locking down those API calls, locking down that console is absolutely critical. So what do? Basically require MFA for console login. And this happens at the IAM policy level, right? So require MFA for console, require MFA for the API or command line, environment or pass the MFA status from your identity provider and build those policies to ensure that you can't do stuff unless you are logged in as MFA. When I referred to conditionals before, that would be another conditional, could be your dev or your prod environment, could also be different policies if you are multi-factored in versus if you aren't. So not enabling monitoring would be our fourth of the 5 top security mistakes. And again, why? Because we still have to figure out what's going on. So what we want to do is make sure that we have enabled CloudTrail, which is AWS's logging service, in all accounts, in all regions, right? So we want to make sure that we've turned it on. And by the way, in a lot of cases, it's not turned on by default, unless you've set something up at your organization level. So that's something that one of the first things you want to do is add MFA, lock down your root account, and then turn on logging and monitoring for any new AWS account that you put into place. So other issues, not sending CloudTrail to CloudWatch, and CloudWatch is Amazon's monitoring and alerting service. So CloudTrail, think about it just as, this is all the stuff that's happening in my environment. CloudWatch is the monitoring service that looks at all of that traffic and tells you, hey, we got to alert on this. We found something there. Not enabling AWS Guard Duty, Trusted Advisor, VPC flow logs, or AWS config. And again, those are native AWS services that do provide some measure of analysis and assessment in the environment. Level 4, right, not doing anything with the logs, not enabling security alerts, lack of central logging and alerting management. So basically, the point here is a huge mistake that folks make when they're moving into AWS and doing things in AWS is not watching, right? Not paying attention to the store, not seeing what's happening in their environment. So what you want to do is make sure that you are putting in place a logging resource that is central to all of your AWS environment and abstracted out to ensure that you can monitor everything. What are some of the issues? Lack of visibility. That was one of the complexities I mentioned early on. Unidentified security events, lack of forensics, slow or no response to security incidents, right? Failed audits. So lots of problems with not thinking about logging and monitoring as a utility for the environment. So how do we fix that? Use AWS organizations trail. So organizations is a way to structure an enterprise's AWS accounts and have consistent policies there. We mentioned SCPs or service control policies as well. Those are organizational constructs to make sure that all of the accounts that you have in your AWS environment are consistent and are configured consistently, have consistent security policies, can use some services, can't use others. So at within AWS organizations, you have the ability to set up a trail for all of the accounts within that organization and centralize that trail. That's a key aspect of doing things. Always link CloudTrail to CloudWatch. So we want CloudWatch to be monitoring our CloudTrail environments. And by the way, you think, duh, why wouldn't that be by default? Well, you actually have to set up an identity management role to allow CloudWatch access to your CloudTrail environment. So when I said identity is the new perimeter, it really is. I mean, even something as simple as monitoring all of the logs you're collecting, you actually have to explicitly set up a role to do that. Centralize your logs. So you want across all of your different accounts, across all of your different regions to be centralized so that you have one consistent view of your infrastructure. Use SCPs. So SCP is a service control policy. That's something that's done at the organization's level and defines how you can use the services within each of your accounts. Build local or centralized security alerts, but more importantly here, and that's why it's bolded and in purple, right, so that you pay attention here, make sure you have a response process and people. So all of the alerts in the world don't help you if you don't have the people and the process in order to make it happen. And again, that's a great point, a great opportunity, and a great situation to, again, point out our partnership with our friends at Bytes, because that's what they do, right? They have the people, they have the process, they've got the infrastructure in order to take an alert from AWS or something that a tool like DisruptOps will generate and be able to turn that into action to protect your environment. Again, define requirements, right? Collect required CloudWatch events across the regions, and continually assess for compliance. So that's what we want to do to fix it. Here's just a little screenshot of setting up your org trail and delivering log files for all regions to one AWS S3 bucket. So that's really where I'm going to put all of my logging in one environment, so accessible only to the security environment to make sure that we're able to manage that. And then finally, exposed admin ports, port 22 or 389. Again, those are, you know, kind of how we get access to that. Why does this happen? Because developers can be lazy, accidental, right? Temporary group kept by mistake. But what that also does is it enables brute force attack to the resources in your environment, which would allow them to be compromised, right? Compromised server container, pivot versus metadata, attacker persistence. How do we fix that? We want to continually assess our environment, again, with a tool like DisruptOps or the AWS Trusted Advisor and Inspector tools to make sure that we've got those ports locked down in our environment. So I'll just drop this here, and then I will turn it over to Matt in a second. Right, for security to succeed at scale in the cloud, you must use automation, because hopefully I didn't scare everybody off from AWS because of the complexity. The point is you have to be much more intentional about how you do security and how you think about your policies and really how you assess them and ultimately how you remediate problems and issues that you find. And that's really where, again, DisruptOps comes in to provide continuous control of your cloud infrastructure. And with that, I probably went a few minutes long, but that's okay. Matt'll make up for it on the back end. So let's see if we can turn things over to Matt at this point, and he'll give you a little bit more background on DisruptOps.
Awesome, thanks, Mike. Appreciate it. Yeah, what a great presentation of the challenges and the key challenges that users face when adopting AWS. And now that you get a sense from Mike about, you know, what to do, right? What are the things to look for, how to think about that process. We now can talk about kind of the next challenge, which is the ability to not only know those things, but to do something about them. And that's really where DisruptOps and our partnership with Bytes comes into play. We need to not only know about these cloud issues, but we need to make sure that they're handled and resolved. The DisruptOps platform is an implementation of that. We are what Amazon calls a take action partner, which is very much that. It's partly about finding things internally. It's certainly about integrating with the AWS environment to know about the issues and findings that they are aware of, and then doing something with that. One quick slide, and then I'll do a simple demonstration of the DisruptOps platform. This slide really is a picture of what we think of as a guardrail. And it very much follows the thought process that Mike just outlaid for all of those 5 things, right? And I've taken his final finding there of the top 5 and said, hey, what do we do when we have port 22 open to the internet, right? And so there are a couple of building blocks to that. First is you got to be aware of the cloud environments themselves. And at DisruptOps, we do not only AWS, but Azure as well. And we will do Google Cloud next. So we have a sense of the configuration of the cloud environment itself, as well as the events that are flowing from the cloud providers and even third-party providers that may be doing assessment of the cloud environment. But once we have that, we're going to go through a set of steps, and this is what it looks like. The first is that assessment, right? We're going to go look for things. Mike just outlined 5, and there are many more than 5 of the things that we're going to go look for. When we find that, we're going to create an issue, right? When we know that a particular EC2 instance is configured improperly, for instance, port 22 is open to the entire internet. It may just be one IP address, maybe the entire internet. We want to do something. We want to correct that. And correcting it takes on a couple of different steps. The first is this thing called an action decision. And an action decision is all about getting this information into the right work stream, right? It's great to know this, and it's great for a central security organization to know this, but how do our operators participate with this? right? It may be things like an incident management process. It may be integrating with things like an agile product process, where our DevOps teams are going to prioritize the changes they need to make. It may be a DevOps operational process directly that we need to go integrate into. We need to be able to get this information to the right folks in the consoles that they think about so that they can take action. And taking action is about more than just fixing the problem, right? It's fixing the problem with communicating to the right set of folks, wrapping up the process, closing out the tickets, ensuring that that holistic organizational process is completed, is all about are all the things that are necessary for a take action partner inside of AWS. So let me flip over here and let's look at our product and just give you a sense of the different things that DisruptOps handles for you. And the first thing is detection, right? If we're going to go fix problems, the first thing we have to do is know about them. DisruptOps handles that in two ways. The first way is we assess internally to our product your cloud configuration. We do that with things we call assessments. And what assessments are is set of logic that we go through to find gaps between known good security standards and your current configuration. All 5 of the things that Mike just outlined are included in our product. So all 5 of those are covered and then some. We have about 150 different assessments that we go through across both Azure and AWS. Here's a great example of enforcing compliant CloudTrail. One of the things that Mike mentioned as one of those top 5 issues, being able to assess and find where CloudTrail is not compliant. Public S3 buckets, another one of the ones that Mike talked about. We have the ability to detect that inside of our product. And if I click on this, it'll load up the assessment and show the process that we go through to identify those things. There are also a set of filters here. Filters are very important, right? It's that control logic. We want to find all the public S3 buckets, but there are probably a handful of public S3 buckets in your application that are necessarily public. And we don't want to constantly find those as false positives. So we can filter them out, right? And we can do that based on a particular project or account. We can do it based on a set of tags, right? So if you've tagged all the ones that should be public in a certain way, we can respond to that. We can also do it by known IP addresses. But when we find a bucket that's public, we create an issue inside of our product, and that issue then is able to be managed. And if I double click on this, you'll see that we've got all the details about the policy and the public bucket that is identified, as well as 2 really important buttons at the top of my screen here. One says mark exempt, which is exactly that. It's a whitelisting process that allows me to manage this issue by marking it exempt and annotating that public S3 bucket is okay and we shouldn't see that again. The second, even more interesting, right, is to take action. I can go and fix this from here. And this is that screenshot you saw in Mike's presentation that says, hey, we can either restrict that bucket policy down to some known source addresses, or we can remove the bucket policy altogether. Either of those activities will ensure that that S3 bucket is no longer public. So here, right, I can go through that process and correct that issue right here. Even more powerfully, I can create what we call an op. And an op is the ability to do that exact same flow automatically. This is what an op looks like. So here is identifying a non-compliant CloudTrail configuration. So our trigger, our identification step says we've identified something that is non-compliant. Then we have a decision. You'll see that I've selected to do that with a Slack message. We support MS Teams and Jira as well. But what this is about getting this information into the right work stream, right? Great, we now know that we've got a non-compliant CloudTrail. What do we want to do? Well, let's integrate with folks who can provide input into that process. And we'll do that through Slack or Teams or Jira. And then an action. when we find that and integrate with that work stream, what do we want to do? Well, we want to be able to simply, with a click of a button, create that compliant cloud trail. So we've got to give it a couple of key inputs, including its S3 bucket as well as its home region. But when we do that, now inside of my Slack or Teams, I have the ability simply to click a button and remediate that. Of course, we can do that, and then notify at the end is the fourth step there of an op. And of course, we can do that through a process like ChatOps. We can do it through something like Jira as well. Here's an example of an identification where we have a PCI finding that has flowed through into my Jira and is now a ticket inside of Jira for me as a product manager to go manage, right? And now I know about a PCI finding, and that may be an immediate thing that we need to go correct, and I'll escalate this. Or it may be something that is a longer term fix where I need to prioritize it in parallel with the other activities that I'm going through. So again, a work stream that is where this information is now injected to ensure that we'll be able to correct all of these issues that have been identified.
And Matt, if I can interrupt for a second,
yeah,
I think that's
sure,
a great, kind of point to make, in that we have a lot of flexibility in terms of, managing the environment via Slack, managing it via Jira. Other tools will be supported as well, to really kind of figure out what that, workflow and what that escalation is going to be between a managed security partner like Bytes and a customer that's managing their own environment. So you can really very flexibly determine who has access to that Slack channel or Microsoft Teams channel, right? Who's going to make those changes? Where are, kind of those authorizations and authorities, to make sure that you've got the proper workflow between your managed security partner and the folks within the customer who are really responsible to ensure that those problems are fixed.
Yeah, great point, Mike. Thanks. And that is one of the things that we see a lot of, which is now we know about things, we want to go fix them. And what is that process that's going to make sure those things get fixed, whether it's from a great partner like Bytes or whether we're going to do pieces of this internally? We have the ability then to scale that up and make sure that that is happening. And Mike started his presentation with this thought, and I'll leave you with the same one, which is some of these things can seem easy to do when you are looking at a single cloud account. When you go and scale your cloud deployment, cross account, cross region, sometimes across cloud, when you go do some of this stuff in Azure and some of it in AWS, this gets incredibly complex. So automating the ability not only to detect these things, but to respond to them as well, make sure they get into the right work stream. There's a lot of complexity there. And so thinking about an automation tool and a great partner like Bytes are great ways to go overcome those challenges. All right, I know we've only got a few minutes left, so I'll turn it back to Danielle and see if we have any questions.
Just while we're doing that, what I will cover off is next steps. So I think everyone, hopefully you'll agree, the content there from the guys has been superb, really insightful. But like they said, there's one thing, building in automation into a platform and doing this yourselves. There's another thing, working with the partner who's got the tried and tested experience. And so, what we'd like to do post today is to offer a few next steps and hopefully try and help you prove out some of the reasons why this needs to be addressed, and hopefully that DisruptOps would be the platform for you to use. So we've got the ability to do a proof of value engagement with DisruptOps. So typically that would involve a quick scene setting call, a conversation where we outline what we're both trying to achieve and get a bit of an understanding of your environment. But really, we want to get Disrupt plugged. We want to get the platform plugged into your AWS or Azure in tenants environments and start getting that view of some of those areas that need to be looked at and what remediation might look like, so that we can try and prove out the value of the platform and create and help with justifications. Separate to that, and that's typically a few weeks of engagement. There's no cost for you to adopt that, so by all means just go through Tell Me More at Bytes, go through your account manager at Bytes, and and we'll be able to talk you through that in more detail. We also have a couple of other services that I think are relevant to help you get you started on getting more visibility of what you're doing in cloud. So we have our Cloud Snapshot service, which is very much looking at cost and technical optimization of your cloud environments, again, both Azure and AWS. And then finally, we can do some cloud workshops. So depending on whether you're an Azure house or an AWS house, will depend on whether that can be funded or not. But if you have specific projects, if you're looking at migrations and you want help with understanding what that might look like and Bytes' approach, then please engage us. No commitment to do anything with us, but hopefully you'll get a view of the capabilities and kind of resources within our team. So without further ado, let me hand back to Danielle to run through some questions that have been raised in the last few minutes.
Thank you, Adam. That's perfect. So yes, guys, if you've got any questions to ask, then do pop them in the questions box. But I'll just get going with a couple that we've got already. AWS Security Hub provides some compliance posture assessments. How do you differ with it, and what's your advantage?
Matt, you want to take that one first, or?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great question, and they do. Security Hub does a good job of doing assessments for both CIS as well as PCI, are the two big ones that they cover. We certainly think of Security Hub as a great partner of ours. I mentioned, but we didn't spend much time on it, but I mentioned that we can take action based on things that we identify internally or external events. And Security Hub is a great external event partner of ours that is natively integrated into DisruptOps. So we can respond to a compliance finding, whether it's done internally in DisruptOps or externally from Security Hub. So really, in terms of taking action, there isn't much difference between where a compliance finding has originated. And we certainly think of Security Hub as a fantastic partner to and augmentation to what we're doing.
Brilliant, thank you, Matt. You mentioned building our own assessments and guardrails. What are the pros and cons of doing that versus using a third-party tool?
Yeah, sure. So, obviously one of the things that AWS has been built to do is provide a platform for what they call builders, right? But developers, operations people, security professionals, to really build a lot of their own technologies. Some of the challenges, certainly you have access via the APIs to all of the telemetry that a third-party tool is going to be. But if you wanted to build your own assessments, you want to build your own guardrails, again, that involves one, coding, two, making sure that you're staying on top of all the different services that you have and that AWS continues to update and roll out. So again, you look, they've got somewhere in the order of 3,000 or 4,000 new features that they introduce every year, and that's accelerating. Those are things you have to continue to stay on top of. And then there's just the operational challenges of managing assessments within each account, within each region, to ensure that you can get a consistent view of your environment from an assessment standpoint, and then to, again, kind of build, test, and manage and keep current all of the automations and functions that you would build in order to do that. Again, it's not that you can't do that. We've certainly seen companies, we've had customers, and we have customers that actually have built a lot of their own automation code because it wasn't available in a commercial environment, a commercial situation, to take a lot of those burdens off of the customer. But what we found is that yes, you absolutely can do it yourself. At some point, that passes the point of diminishing returns in terms of value, and it just makes more sense to look at a commercial offering that is going to provide the scale, is going to provide the currency in a very dynamic environment, and really just take the onus and the impetus off of you to manage and maintain a lot of these fairly complicated workflows. So that's kind of what we've seen out there in the field.
Lovely, thank you, Mike. So another one, our organization is moving towards DevOps. What is the role of security when another team controls the technology?
Ooh, Matt, you want to take that one? You want me to?
Sure. Well, I'll give a few thoughts, Mike, and then you can. I know for the folks I've been working with, there are a couple of models, right? There's the DevSecOps model, which I think is all about embedding security directly onto the DevOps team. The other key model that we see is the idea of a cloud center of excellence, which is more of the idea of centralizing security intelligence organizationally. And there are pros and cons to both, but I will tell you that we see the Cloud Center of Excellence more and more. And I think there are a couple of reasons for that. One, I think it's hard to find cloud security talent right now. Not many people are trained up on the security aspects of the cloud. And so centralizing it and making some recommendations to DevOps teams is a great way to think about it. And in that model, I think you see organizations, security is providing oversight and recommendations, even if they aren't directly implementing security themselves. Mike, does that jive with what you're saying?
It does, and I think what we're really seeing is kind of an evolution of the security practice as we move into cloud, right? So it becomes less about specifically operating stuff and more about setting those policies, understanding, how security should be integrated into a continuous development and continuous deployment type of environment. But all the same, you sit there and go, well, we want to make a lot of those changes in templates. We want to, kind of automate a lot of what we're doing just as part of our development process. The reality is you still have a window of exposure between the time where you identify an issue and the time that you can actually fix it in a specific template and have that code deployed through the rest of your environment. So it's not just a matter that the security team is just focused on policy. They still have to have a little bit of an operational role relative to enforcing, those best practices until they can be, kind of built back into the environment. So we'll have to wear two hats for a while, but I really do like, and we've seen be very successful, this idea of the Cloud Center of Excellence to set those policies, but also to be able to enforce those best practices, ensure that those ops or those guardrails are actually implemented to reduce the exposure of the environment. Again, in a perfect world, everything happens, as code within our, pipeline, since we moved to this agile DevOps type of world. But in the meantime, somebody's still going to have to fix some stuff until we can go back and fix the code. And that's really where tools like DisruptOps and, kind of security ops does evolve to.
Thank you very much for that, guys. It doesn't look like we've had any more questions coming in for the moment, but like I said, if you do have any, please send them to tellmemore@bytes.co.uk, or you can just pop them in the survey at the end. So I think we'll wrap it up there then. Thank you so much to Mike and Matt for speaking today, and also thank you to Adam. So I hope you all enjoy the rest of your day, and hope to see you on another webinar soon. Thank you.